Minister Miller, the PBO, in his report on the fall economic update, had some pretty scathing statements to make about the timeliness and lack of transparency on the release of the public accounts and the annual financial report. Now, it's my understanding that reopening and some of the stuff that happened around that I'm trying not to get into a bunch of accounting lingo here on you, but that happened around the $40 billion settlement that was going on at the time, and that's kind of what triggered a lot of this. So I get the connection, but what I'm wondering is that if you can tell the committee what it was about the agreements and the timing that forced you to in an unprecedented way reopen public accounts that were already signed off on. They were done, they were finished. They eventually got tabled later than they had since 1994. And as I said, they had to be reopened. And ultimately what happened is there was just about $10 billion that got backdated back into the accounts for 2021 already. So and the PBO makes it very clear that this was a government decision. And I mean, in his report, he says the government's decision to amend the initial public accounts, as somebody that sits at the cabinet table, can you tell how that played out and what forced you to have to do that?
I never had any discussion of the sort, so I'd have to defer to whoever took that decision. I don't know. Are you suggesting that the PBO said that it had to do with the agreements in principle that were concluded on December 31st?
Well, yeah, it did. If you follow through the notes to the financial statements and the subsequent event notes,
I'll confess
it was directly connected to that.
I haven't read it, but
in essence, what it looks like, Minister, is and that's the frustration. It looks like, in essence, what happened is these accounts got open so that we could take $10 billion of the $40 billion and put it back in last year when there was already a $327 billion deficit and not have to account for it going forward. That's the appearance of it, it might be legal, but it sometimes we're putting our toes on the edge of, and it doesn't seem transparent in my mind. I guess that's my concern.
When we look at Indigenous liability and we look to account fairly, there are many large items that I would like to track back fiscally to the 1800s, and in this case, track them back to 1990. We're talking about $40 billion, $20 billion in making sure we don't continue the discrimination that has heretofore occurred, and $20 billion to settle liability that's gone in various areas back to the 1990s. So if I could attribute it to prior governments, I would love to do it. But I know that is not a proper accounting mechanism, but it's probably a fair one to do if you look at it from.
Minister, I'm not talking about the amounts. I'm talking about the process.
I wouldn't know. It was
unprecedented process. So, just maybe one quick follow-up question, because I am going to run out of time, I'm sure, pretty quickly here, Mr. Chair. As Minister Hayes, you talked about the whole $40 billion child welfare settlement, it was two pieces, two $20 billion pieces. You and I have had this conversation. In essence, what's happened, if I understand it correctly, is the departments have tasked the FN with going out and collecting the data to try to get these agreements in principle to a finalized point by March 31st, 2022. Now, that's what the aim was, right? I'm hearing some concerns that First Nations that are not part of the AFN are upset about the process because they feel like they're being excluded. The minister earlier in the first session talked about fair and collaboratively working towards this. Are you hearing that same concern, or is that just something I'm hearing through other sources? I'm just curious if you're hearing that same issue and how you're addressing it, if you are.
Yeah, and it's, ultimately it won't be me that addresses it, it'll be the court. And what we're talking about is two separate items. One, historical compensation, which is largely driven through, while imperfect, a well-acknowledged process to achieve redress of grievance, which is a class action. But when we're talking about long-term reform...
Yeah, but my point, Minister, is about the process and engaging the First Nations. You set out to engage First Nations to come to an agreement by March 31st. I'm not arguing about the components. I'm talking about the process. Has there been concern about the process from non-AFN member First Nations?
I think you'll always find concern with the process, and you will find concern with the process from people that don't consider AFN to speak for them. And when it comes to children and their families, it can be a very sensitive issue. You compound that by the fact that you're talking about historical amounts that, yes, while they are an attempt to take away the discrimination that's occurred. We're talking about large amounts that will impact communities and will impact individuals. I'm confident that the process is equitable, but certainly those concerns are there. I have a lot of faith in the advocacy of Dr. Blackstock. She has not been afraid to speak up for children, regardless of who that impacts, any level of leadership, foremost the federal government. But it is a concern, obviously, and I'm sure it's a concern for AF.